Helen Ruiz sat alone on the peeling wooden boards of her back porch, the late afternoon sun painting everything in shades of molten gold. Today was her 68th birthday, and yet the world felt eerily silent. She held a cold mug of chamomile tea in both hands, its warmth doing nothing to thaw the hollow ache in her chest. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet, just the distant chirp of cicadas and the hum of a passing car on Maple Street. Inside the modest white clapboard house she'd helped pay off over decades of hard work, laughter floated through the open windows. That laughter belonged to her daughter, Alicia, and her family. Helen could almost taste the scent of takeout fried chicken mingling with leftover birthday cake she would never see. The table was set, paper plates, plastic forks, the faded centerpiece that said, "Happy Birthday, Mom," in curving cursive letters. But nobody had bothered to send gifts, flowers, or even a simple card. Nobody had bothered to call her, not even Alicia. Helen closed her eyes and let the orange sky fill her vision. She remembered the birthdays from years past. Alicia balanced on her mother's knee, giggling as Helen blew out candles on a homemade vanilla cake. They'd sung Happy Birthday together, voices cracking with joy and love. Those days felt like a different lifetime. Once, this house had rung with celebration, friends and family crowding every corner. Now, there was nothing but the distant laughter that served as a cruel reminder of her exclusion. A rustle in the hydrangea bushes made her glance up. Her grandson, Julian, peeked out from around the corner of the house. He was barely 9, with sandy hair that fell into his eyes. He waved hesitantly, as if nervous about intruding. Helen managed a faint smile and lifted her mug in greeting. He blinked, then turned and sprinted back inside. "Grandma's out there," he whispered to someone unseen. Helen heard Alicia's voice, warm but distant, reply, "Not now, honey." "Grandma's fine." That was when Helen realized the truth. She wasn't part of their lives anymore. At best, she was an afterthought. At worst, a burden. The notion crushed her. Tears blurred her vision as she stood, placing the mug on a cracked step. She reached up and brushed at her hair, though it was no use. Strings of silver framed her face, a testament to years spent caring for others, wife, mother, grandmother, and now, nothing. Helen took one last look at the glowing sky. In that moment, she made a decision. She would no longer sit and wait for scraps of attention. She would reclaim her life, rediscover her worth. It was her birthday, after all. She deserved more than silence. Stepping off the porch, Helen felt a small spark ignite inside her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. She inhaled deeply, tasting the summer air. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow I begin again. Helen sat stiffly at the head of the long farmhouse table, the flicker of the single-pillar candle in front of her, doing little to warm the cold knot in her stomach. The room smelled of roasted chicken, buttery mashed potatoes, and green beans tossed with garlic, comfort food, but tonight it tasted like ash. Across from her, Alicia raised a crystal wine glass, the deep red liquid sloshing gently. The low hum of conversation died down as Alicia cleared her throat. "We've been talking about our finances," Alicia began, her voice bright and businesslike. She glanced around the table, toward her husband, Mark, their teenage son, Marcus, and a couple of friends from the local high school football team. Everyone leaned in, curious. "And, Mom, unless you can contribute to the rent, it's not really fair to stay." A cold silence followed. Helen's mouth went dry. Contribute to the rent? She'd lived here for nearly 20 years, through ups and downs, helped pay the mortgage, fixed the plumbing, patched holes in the drywall. Yet here she was, treated like a tenant. Alicia tapped the rim of her glass. No rent, no stay, she added with a smug smile. That's what adults do. Helen's vision swam. Mark shifted in his seat, shot his wife an apologetic look, then turned back to nod, as if her ultimatum were completely reasonable. Marcus shrugged, more interested in the plate of cornbread at his elbow than his grandmother's expression. One of the football players whispered something, laughed, and passed the potatoes. Helen's hands balled into fists beneath the table. She could feel the rough weave of the linen tablecloth cut into her knuckles. She forced herself to breathe. Inhale, exhale. She tried to summon the voice she used when she taught third graders about fractions and spelling words, calm, patient, firm. But the right words wouldn't come. Alicia, Helen said, her voice quavering, you know I helped you out when you were in school. I paid for half your college tuition. She forced herself to meet her daughter's eyes. And I've lived here rent-free. Why, exactly, do you think I owe you now? Alicia shrugged one shoulder. Things change, Mum. She raised her glass again. We're tightening up. It's just business. Helen felt as if someone had punched her in the gut. She swallowed hard. Business. She wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. I see, she managed. Without another word, she stood, the chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. She picked up her napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it beside her plate. The room was silent. Marcus looked up, startled. The football players sat frozen, their mouths half open. Helen leveled her gaze on Alicia. Enjoy the rest of your dinner, she said quietly. Then she turned and walked out of the dining room, each step echoing with finality. Behind her, the conversation resumed, muffled but unrepentant. In the hallway, Helen paused by the front door, her heart pounding. The draft of evening air slipped beneath the wood. She reached out, gripped the doorknob, and felt, for the first time in years, the sharp thrill of freedom. Helen didn't raise her voice. There was no dramatic outburst, no pleading for sympathy. She simply stood from the dinner table, picked up her plate, and carried it to the kitchen sink. The silverware rattled gently as she scraped leftover gravy and peas into the garbage disposal. Behind her, the hum of conversation resumed, punctuated by the clink of cutlery and half-hearted laughter. Helen washed her plate, rinsed the dishes, and stacked them in the drainer with deliberate calm. Each motion felt surprisingly soothing, like the tide pulling away debris from the shore. When the dishes were done, she moved through the hallway toward the small room they'd settled her into ever since she'd moved in after her husband died. It was barely larger than a closet, the single narrow window overlooking the side yard. A twin bed occupied one corner. A diminutive wardrobe stood against the opposite wall. Pink floral wallpaper peeling at the edges made the room feel both cozy and suffocating. Helen switched on the bedside lamp and sat on the edge of the mattress. She reached under the bed and pulled out a battered suitcase, one she'd owned since her teaching days. Her hands, though trembling slightly, worked methodically. She folded a favorite cardigan, the soft lavender knit that had been Alicia's when she was a child. She packed a pair of worn jeans, 2 comfortable blouses, a set of pajamas. She even tucked in an old leather-bound journal, its pages filled with poems she'd written in her 40s. With each folded item, Helen felt a growing sense of resolve. This was not defeat, it was self-respect. She zipped the suitcase closed, slung it over her sturdy shoulder, and glanced around the cramped room. The wallpaper's floral print reminded her of spring mornings with her late husband, when they'd sit on this very bed and whisper dreams for the future. But those dreams had crumbled. It was time to dream new ones. Before leaving, Helen took a deep breath and walked into the kitchen. The house was silent now, the family having returned to their dinner. She opened the refrigerator door and retrieved a piece of scrap paper from the magnet collection on the front. She found a pen and scribbled, "Thank you for the roof. You'll never need to worry about me again. Mom." She stuck the note on the fridge door, pressing a magnet to hold it in place. Stepping back, she studied the neat handwriting, the finality of the words. No anger, no reproach, just dignity. Helen lifted her suitcase and walked to the front door. The hallway light cast a long shadow behind her. She paused, her hand resting on the doorframe, and inhaled the faint scent of jasmine from the garden outside. Then, with a quiet click, she opened the door and stepped onto the front porch. The night air was cool, carrying the distant sound of a cricket song. Helen set her suitcase on the welcome mat, took one last look at the house that had been her home for 2 decades, and closed the door behind her. She didn't look back. I found a modest room for rent above a detached garage on Elm Street. The landlord, Mr. Benson, a retired school custodian with a gentle smile, accepted only cash and asked no questions. The room was barely bigger than a closet. A twin bed draped in a faded quilt, a small oak desk tucked beneath the slanted ceiling, and a single bare bulb dangling from exposed rafters. The narrow window looked out onto a patch of untamed grass and a row of maples whose leaves whispered secrets in the breeze. I moved in on a cloudy Thursday afternoon, my battered suitcase perched on the bed. The silence of my new home pressed in around me. No daughter checking in, no grandson's laughter echoing through the halls. The loneliness that had driven me out of Alicia's house now settled into every dusty corner of this spare refuge. By day, I returned to old friends and books long neglected. Agatha Christie's cunning detectives, Hemingway's sunlit harbors, and Steinbeck's drifting fishermen came alive in my lap. I marked favorite passages in a spiral notebook, descriptions of storm-tossed decks, lone lighthouses flashing warnings, and captains who whispered midnight prayers to calm the sea. With each page turned, I felt my spirit stretch and unfurl, as if I too could set sail at dawn. At dusk, I brewed a cup of chamomile tea, much like the one I'd sipped on my birthday porch, and sat by the window. The maples outside became silhouettes against the purple sky. I'd close my eyes and breathe in the night air, tasting salt and sea spray, even though the ocean was miles away. In those minutes, I heard George's voice beside me. "When retirement comes, we'll live on a boat." His promise had carried me through 2 decades, even after cancer stole him from our plans. Night brought dreams of rolling waves and distant horizons. In my sleep, I and George stood together on the deck of a white sailboat, the rigging creaking under our feet. He handed me the wheel, and I felt the thrill of steering us toward a future that had always seemed just out of reach. "One day, love," he murmured against the wind. "Soon," I'd whisper back. Each morning, I rose before sunrise, packed my book in a tote bag, and walked to the small storage locker I rented down the street. Inside lay the first pieces of a new life, a battered wooden oar, a faded life jacket, and a nautical chart of the Atlantic coast. Lifting that chart felt like lifting my dreams from their dusty shelf. In the room above the garage, as the lamp's soft glow chased away shadows, I realized I was no longer merely surviving. I was preparing. Every page I read, Every dream I dared to have was a step closer to the ocean calling my name. And this time, I would answer. Helen sat at the battered oak desk in her rented room, the single bulb overhead casting a warm pool of light across a sea of opened mail. Most of it was junk, advertisements for timeshares in Florida, charity appeals, credit card offers. She sorted them into two piles, trash and maybe later. At the bottom of the maybe later stack was a thick, cream-colored envelope, the return address stamped in crisp black ink, Office of the City Attorney, Probate Division. Helen's heart gave a flutter. She hadn't heard from the probate office since George's will had been filed more than 10 years ago. She picked up a letter opener and slit the envelope's flap, freeing a single sheet of heavy stationery. Unfolding it, she read the formal heading, Estate of George Ruiz, deceased. Below, the city attorney's courteous but precise prose outlined the final accounting of George's remaining assets, specifically a batch of technology stocks he'd purchased in the late 90s and promptly forgotten in the flurry of raising a family, renovating their home, and teaching full-time. After the deduction of all fees, taxes, and mandatory probate expenses, the letter read, the net value of the stock portfolio stands at $5,200,000, $5,200,000, so. Enclosed is a disbursement form for Mrs. Helen Ruiz to complete and return at her earliest convenience. Helen blinked, her pulse racing. She let the letter fall to the desk and stared instead at her computer screen, where her desktop wallpaper displayed a panoramic photograph of the Pacific Ocean, endless cerulean water crashing against jagged cliffs beneath a cloudless sky. She'd set it as her background years ago, a silent promise to herself and to George that one day they'd see the sea up close. 5.2 million. The digits swam in her mind, as bold and glittering as sunlight on the water. She pushed her chair back and paced the small room. The faded floral wallpaper, the single window overlooking nothing but scraggly grass. None of it mattered anymore. She thought of the rented storage locker down the street, the nautical charts and battered ore she'd stashed there. Of the fantasies she entertained at night, a gleaming white yacht bobbing in a turquoise bay, her at the helm, salty wind in her hair, the horizon forever stretching ahead. Helen returned to the desk, scooped up the letter, and read the amount again. Her chest warmed with a curious mix of disbelief and elation. All those years she'd scrimped, saved, and dreamed in private. Now, suddenly, the dream was within reach, and then some. No more waiting, no more wondering if she'd ever set foot on a boat. She picked up her pen, filled in the disbursement form with deliberate strokes, and signed her name, Helen Ruiz. The weight of the pen felt satisfying in her hand, a confirmation that she was no longer a passive observer in her own story. Helen folded the form, slipped it back into the envelope, and sealed it with a quiet sense of triumph. She logged onto her computer, opened her browser, and began researching Yacht, brokers along the East Coast. The ocean's call had never sounded so clear, or so urgent. Maybe it was time. Helen drove through the salt-sprayed morning mist to Bayview Marina, the rented Honda humming beneath her. She parked near a row of polished vessels, fishing skiffs, sailboats with furled white sails, and a few luxury yachts whose varnished decks gleamed like mirrors. The air smelled of diesel and seaweed, a scent that made her heart beat faster. A middle-aged broker with wind-whipped hair and a crisp blazer approached, extending a firm handshake. "Mrs. Ruiz," he said, consulting a clipboard. "Welcome to Bayview. What kind of boat are you looking for today? Helen smiled, her fingers curling around the edge of her purse. She paused, letting the question echo against the backdrop of gently lapping water. The early sun painted the hulls in gold and rose. At that moment she felt, more intensely than ever, every memory she carried, the ache of loss, the pride that had kept her standing, and the fragile peace she was learning to cherish. A boat, she said quietly, that can hold a woman's grief, her pride, and her new peace. The broker raised an eyebrow and clicked his pen. He led her along the dock, past fiberglass hulls and chrome cleats, to a slip at the far end. There, tied with thick braided ropes, floated a sleek yacht, whose lines were at once bold and graceful. Its hull was a deep navy blue, the deck a soft teak that seemed to glow under the sun. The cabins were roomy, with large windows offering panoramic views. Below deck, the salon was furnished in ivory leather and polished mahogany. A quietly luxurious space. Helen ran her hand along the railing, feeling the cool metal beneath her fingertips. Inside, sunlight streamed through skylights, illuminating plush seating and a tidy galley. She opened a cabinet and found neatly stacked plates and wine glasses. Further on, she glimpsed a cozy stateroom with crisp white linens and a bathroom tiled in pale seafoam green. She turned to the broker. "This one," she said. He smiled and handed her a set of keys. Later, Helen stood on the bow, the marina shrinking behind her as the yacht's engine purred to life. The propellers churned, sending ripples across the water, and she felt a surge of exhilaration. She fetched a paintbrush and bottle of marine-grade enamel from the cockpit locker. On the transom, beneath the railing, she painted 2 words in elegant script: "Second Wind." She stepped back to admire her handiwork. The name shimmered in the sunlight, a declaration and a promise. Helen leaned against the rail, inhaling the briny breeze, and watched the waves roll her forward into the wide-open blue. Helen's phone lay silent on the teak tabletop, its screen facing down so she wouldn't be tempted to check it. She'd ventured out each morning before sunrise, chart in hand, learning the compass rose, and plotting courses on her nautical map. Each evening, she watched the sun melt into the horizon, painting the sky in pinks and purples, and felt a growing sense of competence. On the 3rd day at sea, her phone buzzed. She'd just finished securing the dinghy when she saw a single notification, a text from Alicia. "You doing okay?" It was brief, anxious. Helen stared at the words for a long moment. Her heart tightened, but she didn't reply. Instead, she pocketed the phone and climbed back aboard, running through the checklist for anchoring. 3 days later, when she hoisted the mainsail to catch a gentle breeze, her phone rang. Alicia's name glowed on the screen. Helen's thumb hovered over "Answer," and then, without hesitation, tapped "Decline." The ringing stopped. Helen turned her attention back to the sheet and winch, the familiar task grounding her. On the 10th morning of her solo voyage, she woke to the soft thrum of the engine. She brewed coffee and poured it into a chipped enamel mug. Then her phone vibrated again. This time, a voice message from Alicia. Helen pressed play and saw the recording length, 17 seconds. "Mom, we didn't mean it like that," Alicia's voice said, quivering. "We love you. Please come back." Helen closed her eyes and imagined Alicia's face. The old warmth, the tenderness she once knew. But she could also hear the words Alicia had spoken at that dinner table. No rent, no stay. She could almost feel the dismissal behind that smirk. Helen set the phone aside, the recording unplayed. She would not press play. She was already charting a new path, one that Alicia could not derail with a single voice note. Instead, she focused on the task at hand. She studied the chart to avoid a shallow sandbar, marked just 2 miles ahead. She adjusted her course by a few degrees, then secured the autopilot. The yacht glided forward, sails billowing, as she sipped her coffee. She thought of the phrase she'd whispered when she named the boat, second wind. She had found her voice again, learned to steer her life with confidence and clarity. She deserved this solitude, the chance to heal and rediscover herself. Later that afternoon, when the wind shifted and dark clouds gathered on the horizon, Helen braced herself at the helm. She loved the thrill of the storm rolling in, the challenge of keeping the yacht upright and on course. Back in her cabin, her phone lay unchanged. She looked at it once more, then turned it face down again. The ocean stretched out before her, vast, unpredictable, and full of possibility. She was learning to navigate that too. Each morning before dawn, I stepped onto the deck of Second Wind and breathed in the salt air, feeling it fill every empty corner of my chest. The world beyond the marina's harbour wall, wide, wild, and unknowable, stretched out before me, and for the first time in decades, I felt truly alive. I kept a leather-bound journal tucked into the chart table, its edges already curling from sea spray. Every day, I wrote a new entry. Each one began the same way. Dear George, you were right. His handwriting wasn't here, but his voice echoed in my head, the gentle conviction behind those words. I'd recorded the shifting moods of the sea, the soft blue lull before sunrise, the dazzling sparkle under midday sun, and the bruised purples and greys when storms rolled in off the horizon. I wrote about the gulls wheeling overhead, their cries sharp against the roar of wind and wave. By afternoon, I navigated by landmarks I'd never noticed before, a lonely lighthouse perched like a sentinel on ragged rocks, the silhouette of a distant freighter sliding across the water, and the graceful arcs of dolphins riding the bull wake. Each sight stirred something joyful inside me, a thrill I hadn't felt since I first held Julian in my arms. In the evenings, I wrote about my own discoveries, how steady my hands had become as I trimmed the sails, how the vibration of the helm beneath my palms felt like an old friend saying, "You've got this." I described the ache in my shoulders after hauling in the anchor and the delicious exhaustion that followed. Dear George, I wrote one day, today I felt the yacht lean hard under a sudden gust, and instead of panicking, I laughed out loud. Another entry read, I watched the sunset bleed into the sea and realized I'm not running away. I'm finding my way home. The ocean talked back through its rhythms. A calm morning tide reassured me I could trust my instincts. A sudden squall challenged me to rise to the moment. Each ripple and roar was a lesson, reminding me that life itself is a voyage of constant course corrections. At night, I slept in the stateroom with the porthole cracked open, the hush broken only by the gentle slap of waves against the hull. I dreamed of charting new territories, both on maps and within myself. Somewhere between the salt and the sky, I found my purpose again, not defined by roles or expectations, but by the fierce, steady heartbeat of someone who dared to believe in second chances. And every morning, as the horizon widened before me, I whispered, Dear George, you were right. One late afternoon, while skimming Zillow for dream waterfront properties, an idle habit I'd picked up, I paused at a familiar street address, 47 Maple Street. The listing headline read, Pre-foreclosure, in stark red letters. My pulse quickened. I tapped the link and scrolled through the details. Mortgage delinquent, auction pending, homeowner hardship. Memories tumbled in. the laughter of family game nights in that very living room, Alicia's wide-eyed delight as she showed me the freshly painted walls, Marcus practicing his spelling words under the kitchen light, the house I'd helped finance, the home where Julian took his first steps, now in peril. That evening, back aboard Second Wind, my phone buzzed with a text from a mutual friend. Mrs. Ruiz, just wanted to let you know the foreclosure went through this morning. Alicia, Mark, and Marcus moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on Pine Avenue. It's cramped, but they're hanging in there. I stared at the message long after the screen dimmed. A hollow ache gnawed at my ribs, but I didn't reply. Instead, I stood on the aft deck as the ferry horns called in the distance and the harbour lights flickered on. The cool breeze carried the scent of seawater and diesel, 2 smells that now felt nourishing rather than merely familiar. That night, I lay in my mahogany-panelled stateroom, listening to the steady slap of waves against the hull. I pictured Alicia unpacking boxes in that tiny apartment, Marcus's bunk bed pressed against the wall, their mismatched dishes piled in a cramped kitchenette, Mark's worried pacing as he searched for a new job. A part of me longed to send blankets, casseroles, even a simple, "I'm sorry." But another part, newly forged in solitude, stood firm. I realized the distance they'd driven me to had become the boundary that protected my newfound peace. By refusing to engage, I was asserting a hard-won self-respect. I poured a final glass of chamomile tea, savoring its warmth, and whispered to the dark, "This is where I belong." Morning brought a gentle swell. I charted a course out of the harbour toward open water, leaving the lights of the city and all its tangled obligations behind me. My phone remained silent in its berth. I sent them nothing, not even a good luck. And as Second Wind sliced through the dawn-lit waves, I felt conviction settle in my bones. Sometimes, letting go is the kindest act of all. Late one afternoon, I was retying a loose shroud on Second Wind when my phone buzzed in the companionway. I wiped my hands on my faded chambray shirt and checked the screen. A notification from Instagram, a direct message from Julian. My heart skipped. He was only 9, but I'd missed him already more than I could name. I tapped the message and read, "Julian. Grandma, I didn't know. I'm sorry." His words floated on the screen, small and earnest. I closed my eyes and leaned against the polished teak. I thought of that dinner, the way he'd peeked around the corner of the dining room, uncertainty in his gaze. I remembered the fleeting hope in his eyes when he waved at me on the porch. For a moment, I held the phone against my chest. I felt the gentle roll of the yacht beneath my palm, the steady rhythm of water lapping against the hull. I pictured Julian in his bedroom back home, clutching a tablet, fingers hovering over the keys. I wondered what he imagined when he typed, "I'm sorry." I let the silence stretch. Then I set my jaw and tapped, "Reply." "Helen, you're young, but you knew enough to stay silent when your mother shamed me." A single line. Firm, measured. I folded my arms and watched a pair of terns skim the surface of the bay. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the waves in molten gold. I thought of all the ways Julian had been caught in the middle, too young to demand fairness, too loyal to risk his mother's wrath. His apology was pure, unguarded, but he had stood by when I needed him most, and that sting still lingered. I stared at the message bubble, waiting for his response. The screen remained blank. No typing indicator, no new notification. I set the phone face down on the chart table and returned to work, tightening the halyards for tomorrow's sail. As dusk settled, I brewed a cup of mint tea and sat on the forward deck. The sky deepened to indigo, and stars began to emerge. I folded the reply into my thoughts and watched the constellations appear one by one. He never wrote back. In that silence, I felt both sorrow and relief. I had spoken my truth. Julian was still a boy learning his way, and I owed him patience. But I also owed myself respect. I tucked the disappointment away like a tucked-in sail and whispered to the night, "It's okay." And as second wind drifted under the vast star-strewn sky, I realized that some conversations, like courses at sea, require time, adjustment, and the freedom to find one's own horizon. One quiet morning, I heard the familiar ping of an email arriving on my phone. With a slow, deliberate breath, I unlocked the screen and opened my inbox. There it was, an Evite from Alicia, written in her neat, business-like font, complete with pastel balloons and an RSVP button. The subject line read, "You're invited, Julian's graduation party." I tapped through to view the details. Saturday, June 28th, at 4 p.m., back at 47 Maple Street, the house I had once called home. The invitation included photos of Julian beaming in his cap and gown, tassel draped over his shoulder, and a smiling family portrait beneath stylized lettering. Alicia had even added a heartfelt note. "Mom, Julian would love to celebrate with you. He's worked so hard and would be thrilled to see you there." I felt my chest tighten. I remembered that shy wave he gave me on the porch the day I left, and the way he looked proud as he typed, "I'm sorry," weeks ago. For a fleeting moment, the old ache of wanting to belong resurfaced. But then I thought of the smirk Alicia wore as she delivered her ultimatum, the coldness in Mark's nod, and the way our home had become a place of contracts instead of love. I put the phone down on the teak tabletop and stared out at the gentle swell of the harbour. The horizon was clear, the sky pale blue. A soft breeze ruffled the sails. In my mind's eye, I saw myself charting a course through the Adriatic, past azure coves and sunlit cliffs. I sipped my chamomile tea, tasting freedom in every drop. With fingers steadier than they'd been in years, I opened the Evite again and tapped decline. In the RSVP text box, I typed my one-line reply. "I'll be sailing the Adriatic that week. Maybe next life." I hit send and felt the weight lift from my shoulders. I imagined Alicia reading my words, her expression flickering from surprise to frustration, but it no longer mattered. I was already halfway to the Mediterranean in my dreams, learning to trust the wind and chart my own destiny. That afternoon, I unfolded my nautical chart, traced a finger along the Croatian coastline, and whispered to the empty harbour, "Onward." And for the first time in decades, I did so without looking back. After a week of solitary navigation, I dug out my phone and scrolled through the photos I'd snapped. A blazing sunset bleeding into the sea, the bull cutting through turquoise waves, and the salon lit by lantern glow on a misty morning. On a whim, I opened my social media app and uploaded the pictures with simple captions. "Golden hour off Cape May." Squall rolled in fast, reefed the mainsail just in time. "Morning coffee with a view." I didn't expect much, maybe a like or two from fellow sailing enthusiasts. But within hours, comments trickled in. "This is amazing. You're an inspiration." A few friends from my teaching days wrote, "Helen, this is incredible." Their enthusiasm warmed me more than the summer sun. By the second day, my follower count ticked upward. I posted a short video of the yacht slicing through dawn-lit waters, engine off, sails full, no soundtrack, just the wind's whisper. It felt intimate, honest. Then a message popped up in my inbox. "Hello, Helen. I'm Sarah Donovan, a feature writer at the Coastal Chronicle. Your journey caught my editor's eye. Would you be open to an interview? My pulse quickened. A journalist? Me? I hesitated, then typed back, I'd be honored. Over Zoom, I told Sarah about the broken family ties, the city attorney's letter, and the promise George and I had made long ago. She listened with genuine curiosity, asking about the name Second Wind, the challenges of solo sailing at my age, and how it felt to turn grief into adventure. Within days, the article appeared online with a bold headline, Senior buys $5 million yacht after family kicks her out. The story led with a photo of me at the helm, white hair whipping in the breeze, eyes fixed on the horizon. It recounted my 68th birthday on the porch, the no rent, no stay ultimatum, and the astonishing inheritance that funded my voyage. Readers across the country shared the link, adding their own praise and wonder. Comments flooded in. What a boss move. Goals at any age. Even local news stations picked up the narrative, running short segments on their evening broadcasts. I watched as strangers applauded my courage, as women my age messaged to say they'd dusted off long-forgotten dreams. That evening, standing on Second Wind's deck under a lavender sky, I felt a swell of pride and a twinge of disbelief. My private escape had become a beacon for others. I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea, held it to the sky and whispered, "We really are capable of anything." Late one afternoon, as I was coiling the dock lines after a gentle afternoon sail, my phone buzzed insistently in my jacket pocket. I glanced at the screen. Block number. For a moment, I hesitated, my finger hovering over answer. But then something urged me on, and I tapped the green icon. Hello? My voice was steady, though I felt a flutter in my chest. On the other end, Alicia's voice trembled like a sail in a stiff breeze. Mum, it's me. She paused, swallowing hard. Everyone saw that article. They think I'm a monster. I listened as she poured out her anguish, gossip at her office, whispers at the PTA meetings, pointed stares from neighbors who'd once waved at me in the driveway. She spoke of guilt, shame, and regret, her voice crackling with tears. I waited until she took a shaky breath. Alicia, I said, soft but firm, I'm not trying to punish you. I leaned against the cold metal rail, feeling the subtle rise and fall of Second Wind beneath my feet. I'm just finally visible. Alicia sniffed. I didn't know how much you hurt or how strong you'd become. I wasn't sure myself, I admitted, but grief can carve out strength you never knew you had. I pictured her at the kitchen table, surrounded by balloons and half-filled cups of punch, and the sudden emptiness that had followed my departure. I needed everyone who ever dismissed me to see the woman I really am. She choked back a sob. I'm sorry, Mum. I was so wrapped up in our struggles. I didn't see how much I was hurting you. I drew in a long breath, the salty air filling my lungs. This isn't about blame, I said. It's about choices. You chose to leave me with nothing but a closet of a room. You chose to speak about rent like it defined my worth. I know, she whispered. I was wrong. I paused, letting the moment stretch between us, waves lapping, rigging creaking, gulls calling. Alicia, I finally said, I love you, but I can't go back to being invisible. Tears glistened in her voice. I understand. We stayed on the line another minute, neither of us sure what to say next. Then Alicia spoke again. Can we stay in touch? I closed my eyes, feeling the boat rock beneath me. I thought of the horizon, endless and open, and the new life I'd built there. Yes, I said softly. On my terms. Thank you, she whispered. I hung up, slipped the phone into my pocket, and turned to face the bow. The sun was dipping low, igniting the water in flames of orange and gold. I ran my hand along the polished rail and breathed deeply. Finally visible, I realized, meant being seen in the full truth of who I'd become. And as second wind carried me toward tomorrow, I felt ready for whatever came next. A week after Alicia's call, I found a crisp white envelope tucked into my Marina mailbox. The postmark read Los Angeles, and I recognized Julian's neat block letters on the front. I carried it back to second wind, set it on the chart table, and paused before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper filled in pencil. "Grandma, I hope you're having fun on your boat. When Mum told me you bought a yacht, I couldn't believe it. I think about you every time I see the sea, the way the waves sparkled on our porch when I was little. If you're ever anchored near LA, I'd love to see second wind. Maybe you could teach me how to sail just like you. Love, Julian." I traced the curves of each letter with my fingertip. The apology he'd sent weeks ago had gone unplayed in my messages, but this I read slowly, savoring every word. I imagined him standing on a crowded dock in Santa Monica, eyes wide, scanning the masts for a navy blue hull with its name painted in silver script. A soft breeze slipped through the open companionway, carrying the faint scent of diesel and salt. I folded the letter neatly along its creases and slid it back into its envelope. My hands trembled just enough that I paused to steady them. I thought of the life I'd chosen, the freedom of endless horizons, the wind in my hair, and the solitude that had become my solace. I remembered the hard lines I'd drawn with Alicia, boundaries that had shielded me from old hurts. And now here was Julian, his innocence and hope overflowing onto the page. Without a word, I tucked the sealed envelope into my jacket pocket. I didn't want to break my stride. I wanted to remain the woman who had found her second wind, steadfast at the helm, steering toward new shores. Responding felt like a detour back to a place I'd already left behind. That evening, I clipped a fresh photo of second wind, taken under a lavender sunset, and slipped it into the Marina bulletin board's letters and photos slot, along with my initials in the corner. Maybe he'd find it there. Maybe he'd know I was thinking of him, even if I didn't reply directly. I lit a lantern on the foredeck and watched the glow ripple across the water. The harbour was calm, the night sky full of stars. Somewhere out there, Julian might spot the board and dare to hope. And somewhere in me, a small spark flickered. But for now, I let the silence stand. I folded the marina map, closed the cabin door, and climbed to the bridge. As second wind rocked gently beneath me, I whispered to the dark, "Some things are best sent without expectation." And with that, I set my course into the night. It was George's birthday, though he'd been gone these past 10 years. Dawn colored the sky in soft apricot and rose petals, and I stood on second wind's foredeck, holding a single red rose between my fingers. The petals still glistened with morning dew. I paused to remember the first time he gave me roses, hand-picked from the little patch we tended by the porch, sun-warmed and fragrant. He'd smiled as he pressed one into my hand and whispered, "For my forever love." Those moments felt as vivid as the breeze lifting my hair now. In my journal, I'd already written today's entry. "Dear George, it's your birthday. I'm adrift in the sea we dreamed of, steering toward horizons we never reached together." I folded the page and tucked it into the leather-bound notebook that lay on the helm. Then I held the rose aloft, its stem catching the light. A flock of gulls wheeled overhead, their cries echoing like old laughter. I bent over the rail and whispered, "See, darling." I'm finally living the life we imagined. My voice trembled with a mixture of sorrow and triumph. The ocean breathed beneath me, an immense, rolling promise. With a gentle flick of my wrist, I released the rose. It drifted across the steel blue water, petals afloat like tiny beacons of memory. For a heartbeat, I watched it dance on the swell, carried by currents I could neither see nor control. The rose sank slowly, stem first, until only the bloom remained, bobbing like a small red planet on the vast blue expanse. Then the waves closed over it, and it slipped from view. I stayed motionless, letting the empty space remind me of both loss and liberation. The sun climbed higher, scattering diamonds across the sea's surface. I straightened, wiped my cheeks, salt from tears or from the sea I couldn't tell, and turned back to the helm. The compass needle held firm, pointing toward a new course. As second wind cut through the morning light, I felt George's presence in every wave and wind gust. The anniversary rose was gone, but its promise remained. That love endures, carried on tides we cannot predict. I whispered to the horizon, "Happy birthday, my love." And with that, I sailed onward. I had just tied up second wind at a quaint marina on the Dalmatian coast, the sun low and golden as fishermen hauled in nets. The air smelled of salt and grilled seafood. I stepped down the gangplank with a canvas tote slung over my shoulder, intending to explore the limestone alleys of the old town, when I heard a voice so familiar it made my heart stutter. "Helen?" I froze. Turning, I saw Alicia standing at the end of the dock. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun streaked with grey, and her shoulders slumped under a well-worn jacket. The lines around her eyes spoke of sleepless nights and hard choices. "Alicia," I whispered, uncertain whether to step forward or retreat. She took hesitant steps toward me, each one echoing on the wooden planks. When she reached the railing, she looked up at the yacht's polished hull, then back at me. Her voice cracked as she said, "I had to see you." I had to say I'm sorry in person. I studied her face, how the years of separation had etched new patterns across her brow, how regret softened the tone of her voice. My mind raced through our last conversations, the ultimatum, the eviction, the unanswered messages. And yet, here she was, across the world on a boat I had named for second chances. I climbed the few steps back onto the deck and reached for the rail. The gentle lap of water against the hull seemed to hush the harbour's clamour. I met her gaze and felt a complicated surge of emotions, compassion, relief, lingering hurt. "You don't owe me an apology," I said, my voice steady despite the flutter in my chest. "But I do owe myself a boundary." She exhaled, a ragged sound like wind through rigging. "I understand," she whispered. "I've crossed oceans to find you, but I can't expect you to throw your life away." I nodded, the Adriatic breeze tugging at my jacket. "I'm glad you came. I'm glad you said the words, but I've spent months learning to trust the wind, to set my own course. I can't let old currents pull me back." Alicia's eyes glistened. She took a small step forward and placed a trembling hand on the rail. "I miss you," she admitted. "I miss our talks, your advice, the way you always believed in me." I felt the ache of shared memories. Julian's spelling tests, holiday dinners, the feel of her young hand in mine. "I miss you too," I said softly, "but some distances are necessary until trust can be rebuilt." She nodded, tears tracking down her cheeks. I handed her a small wooden carving I'd bought in Split, a dolphin riding a wave. "For Julian," I said, "so he knows I'm still thinking of him." Alicia wrapped the gift against her chest and looked up. "Thank you." We stood in silence as the sun dipped below the rooftops, painting the water in fiery hues. Then Alicia turned away, her footsteps light on the dock. I watched her go, feeling the gentle sway of second wind beneath me, a reminder that healing is a voyage with many harbors, and sometimes the bravest act is to forge ahead alone. A day after our reunion in Split, I found Alicia waiting on second wind's aft deck, her face pale beneath the late afternoon sun. When I appeared at the companionway with my windbreaker on, she stepped forward, eyes pleading. "Please," she said, voice trembling, "just 10 minutes." "I need to talk." I hesitated. Every lesson I'd learned at sea told me to keep moving, to avoid the shoals of old pain. But then I remembered the daughter I once knew, the young woman I'd comforted through heartbreak and triumph. I uncrossed my arms. 10 minutes, I agreed. Inside the salon, I set the teak table by the open awning and boiled water in the galley kettle. I measured loose-leaf chamomile, 2 teaspoons for each cup, then poured the steaming brew into our favorite enamel mugs. I carried them back to the deck and placed one in front of Alicia. She wrapped both hands around it, the warmth seeping through her fingers. We sat side by side, the awning overhead flapping softly in the breeze, the horizon line a steady reminder of possibility. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries distant and unhurried. For a moment, we simply watched the water ripple. Finally, Alicia exhaled, her shoulders sagging. "I miss my mum," she said, voice small. "I miss my mum so much it hurts." The words landed between us like a solemn bell. I watched her fingers trace the mug's rim, white-knuckled. My own heart tightened. I thought of that night in the dining room, her ultimatum like a blade, severing years of love, and how a piece of my soul had died there. I set down my mug and faced her. My voice was quiet but unwavering. "Your mother died the day you humiliated her at dinner." Alicia froze, tears spilling over in silent tracks. I waited, giving her space to feel the weight of those words. The wind tugged at my hair, and the yacht creaked gently underfoot. She looked up, eyes flooded with remorse. "Mum, I held up a hand, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement that some truths must be named before healing can begin. "I needed to be seen as more than a burden, Alicia. You took that from me." Alicia's lips trembled. She placed her mug on the deck, slid out of her chair, and knelt beside me. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, voice cracking. "I never realized. I never understood." I studied her bowed head, the silver strands at her temples catching the sun. "I know," I said softly. "That's why I left, to find my own worth." She nodded, tears falling onto her hands. I reached out, touched her shoulder, and felt the tremor of her grief. We sat in silence, 2 women bound by blood and broken promises, under the same awning where wind and waves whispered of renewal. The 10 minutes stretched into the hush of unfolding dusk, and though nothing was fixed, I sensed the fragile beginnings of something new, carried on a gentle current of truth at sea. The morning air was crisp, tinged with salt and promise, as second wind bobbed gently at the dock. I stood at the helm, hands resting on the polished wheel, watching Alicia below. Her eyes were red, her cheeks stained with tears that dripped onto the weathered wood. She reached up, gripping the rail. "Will you ever forgive me?" she asked, voice breaking with the weight of months of regret. I inhaled deeply, tasting the brine on the breeze. For a moment, I let the silence stretch between us, filled only by the low hum of the harbor and the distant cry of gulls. I thought of every harsh word she'd uttered, every door she'd closed, the boundaries I'd built to save myself. Yet I also heard the timbre of her sorrow, pure and unguarded. At last, I turned away from the wheel and gazed out at the open water. The sun danced on ripples, and the horizon beckoned with infinite possibility. I felt the solidity of the yacht beneath my feet, the truth I'd reclaimed over the past months. She stood there, I said quietly, not as the daughter who demanded rent, but as the woman who finally learned to respect herself. Alicia's lip trembled. She knelt on the dock, one hand resting on the cleat where the dock line was tied. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I miss you." My heart ached, but I held steady. I had come this far. I would not waver now. I placed a hand on hers, warming her skin. "I already forgave you," I told her, turning to meet her eyes. "The day I stopped needing you to say sorry." She blinked, confusion and relief mingling in her gaze. I offered a small, sad smile. "We both needed that. Forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves." Alicia's tears fell freely, and she nodded as if understanding for the first time. She rose and stepped back, giving me space. I walked to the bow, where the anchor chain coiled like a dormant serpent beneath my feet. The deck beneath me felt alive with anticipation. I glanced back at Alicia, her silhouette dark against the bright morning sky. She watched, hope and sorrow interwoven in her posture. I raised my voice so the words carried over the water. "Goodbye, Alicia. Be well." Then, with a firm grip, I lifted the anchor lever. The chain rattled as second wind strained against her moorings. Water gushed around the flukes as the anchor broke free, and the yacht's bow turned toward the channel. I guided her out, past the docks and piers, past the slumbering harbour lights. Alicia stood at the rail one last time, waving until the distance swallowed her form. I did not look back again. As second wind picked up speed, the spray kissed my face and the wind tugged at my hair. I steered toward the sunlit horizon, my heart unburdened, free at last to chart the course of my own life. Months slipped by like passing gulls beyond the rail. Out here, there was no schedule except the wind and the tides. I learned to read the barometer's silent language and to trust the quiver of the mast in a rising gale. I danced in storms, leaning into the spray as thunderheads rolled overhead, trimming the sails with laughter bubbling up in my chest. The yacht pitched and yawed beneath me, but I felt more rooted than ever, anchored by the knowledge that I could weather anything. On calm nights, I drifted under a silver moon, its light spilling across the water like spilled ink. I lay on the foredeck with a worn poetry anthology in my lap, reading Frost and Neruda by lantern glow. Each verse became a companion, whispering of loss and hope, sorrow and renewal. I cooked simple meals in the galley, one-pot stews and fresh bread, savouring the ritual of stirring, tasting, and sharing the flavours with only the gulls as company. I spoke aloud to the empty cabin, recounting my day, confessing joys and worries, as if the walls themselves were old friends. I wasn't trying to prove anything, no grand gestures for a cheering crowd. I woke each morning to the gentle rocking of second wind, the horizon unbroken and inviting. I charted courses just for the pleasure of exploration. Hidden coves painted pale green, deserted beaches strewn with driftwood, and tiny fishing villages where children waved as I glided by. I visited ports so small they had no marinas, anchoring offshore and rowing in by dinghy, trading cookies for fresh eggs, or listening to fishermen's tales of ancient wrecks. I learned bits of Croatian and Italian, enough to ask directions and thank strangers who offered me a bench in their shade. In every lighthouse I passed, I left a folded note, a line of verse, my name, and the date. A breadcrumb trail of my passage, a way to say, I was here and I lived. I mailed postcards home that never reached the family I left behind. Instead, I sent them to myself, tacking them to the bulkhead next to my journal and the photo of George laughing on our old porch. They formed a patchwork map of my journey, stitched together by wind and time. And in those open waters, I discovered the greatest gift. Freedom not as an absence of ties, but as the quiet power to choose my own course. I wasn't running from my past. I was sailing toward every possibility the horizon could hold. That night, I sat at the chart table under the soft glow of the navigation light. My journal lay open before me, its pages full of salt-stained ink and weathered edges. I uncapped my favorite pen and wrote in deliberate strokes. They said, no rent, no stay. So I bought an empire of water, and now I belong to the sea. I paused and read the words back, feeling their truth settle deep in my bones. This was more than defiance or a fancy headline. It was my declaration of purpose, inked on paper and carried by wind and tide. I closed the journal and tucked it into its leather cover. Above me, the yacht's teak overhead creaked softly as she rolled on an incoming swell. I rose and walked out to the foredeck, leaving the navigation light low so as not to disturb the night's darkness. The sea stretched out beneath a canopy of stars, each one reflected in ripples that shimmered like scattered diamonds. I stood barefoot on the planks, hands resting on the cool metal rail, and breathed in the brine-scented air. Every inhale tasted of freedom. Every exhale released the weight of old expectations. A pair of bioluminescent waves lapped at the hull, glowing faintly in the black water. I watched them pulse and fade, as if the ocean itself were answering my words, whispering back its approval. The rhythm felt like a heartbeat, a living reminder that I was never truly alone out here. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the folded note from Julian, still tucked safely inside its envelope. I traced the edges with my thumb, but I did not open it. Some messages wait for calmer days. Tonight, I belonged to the sea alone. I turned toward the stern, where the anchor light twinkled like a distant lantern. I flipped the toggle switch, and the deck lights darkened. The yacht melted into the night, the only glow coming from stars overhead and phosphorescence skirting her keel. I sat on the cabin roof and wrapped my shawl around my shoulders. The gentle rocking lulled me into a peaceful hush. In that moment, I felt every lesson those waves had taught me: resilience, solitude, wonder, and above all, the power to chart my own course. With a final glance at the horizon, I whispered, "Thank you," to the sea that had become my home. Then I turned off all the lights, closed my eyes, and listened to the waves love me back.